All right, everybody. What we're going to do here is a quick kind of narrated PowerPoint through some of the lectures about final things about multiple choice that we finished right before break. Intermixed with here are going to be some ed puzzle questions just to kind of check your understanding and to keep you engaged. The first thing I want to mention here are main learning targets for this content, like why I'm talking to you about this, what I want you to know. Hopefully coming out of this, coming out of everything about multiple choice, you understand where they're appropriate, like why would you use these, for what kinds of learning objectives would you use these. The second is that you would be able to apply this content into creating good distractor items, or sorry, good distractors for items, for prompts. So not only that you get what makes them good, but that you could actually make them yourself. We have a little activity about that you'll be doing on the discussion board, and also understanding how to structure them such that they get at higher levels. So not just remembering and understanding, but so that you could get at application level skills as well. So the first thing I want you to think about, we looked at this very briefly, seems like eons ago, is got a standard here, second grade math standard that says, students will be able to measure the length of an object by selecting and using appropriate tools such as rulers, yardsticks, meter sticks, and measuring tape. And what I want you to think about is, first of all, what's going on in this standard? If you were to break this down to its component parts, what are all the specific sub-skills that are going on in this standard? So what are all the things that you as a teacher would want to see that students could do before you would call this standard mastered? Okay, that's the first thing I want you to think about. After that, I want you to think about, okay, what is the laziest method I could use to assess student mastery of this skill? So if you remember the yodeling example from Price is Right, where you kind of start with the laziest method, in this case true false, and work our way up the methods to multiple choice and all that. Thinking about true false, could we get at this with true false? Probably not. I suppose we could have like 20 true false questions, 10 assessing if they could identify the right tool, 10 saying, this is 3 inches and that kind of stuff. We might be able to get at it, but probably not great and probably more work than even the necessary. Matching might be a case where this would make a lot of sense. You can imagine for the first part, if students can identify the right tool, you could have ruler, meter stick, yardstick, measuring tape, whatever on one side. Then you could have different objects, like the length of a house, the length of a sandwich or an ice cream cone or something like that. And if they pick a measuring tape, you'd say it's wrong. You have to really pick distractors or pick things that really truly would be wrong. So something that trying to measure a car with a ruler, you can say definitively no, if they pick that, they haven't mastered the concept. So we probably do that with that. And then you have to have objects where they actually have to do it. You'd have to make sure that you structure, either your matching or your multiple choice item in such a way that they can't get the answer right unless they're actually able to do the measuring themselves. That's the same thing we're doing when we try to mitigate guessing. We want to prevent them from getting the answer right unless they can actually do the skill. But for now, let's kind of poke around with this idea in the multiple choice realm for a second here. So we've got the item here. We've got our distractors. Ignore the weird lettering. Don't know why that is. We've got the stem. We've got the distractors, we've got our right answer. This is kind of the structure of a good multiple choice item. The specific things to look at here, the two kind of main criteria for good multiple choice items, are a clear question. So a question that's a full sentence, it's not complicated language, it's not confusing, it's got all the information necessary to answer it correctly. That's kind of our requirements for the STEM. Then we need our distractors in addition to our correct answer. So having a correct answer is always good. It's always a good first step. I usually say we want to have a 100% correct answer, and then an answer that's something like 75%, 50%, and 25% or something like that. Now, all those three would be wrong, but different levels of wrongness that would tell you something. That's really what makes a good distractor, and is something you always want to make sure to have in your multiple choice items. You want to make sure that there's an item that if selected means they've mastered 100% of the skill. That's the correct answer. But you also want to make sure there are items that if they get them wrong, tells you they've mastered maybe 75% of the skill. Or to put that another way, maybe they've mastered some of the things they need to do to get the answer right, but not all of them. Like maybe they can't apply the skill yet, but they understand the concepts. Well, you want to have a distractor that's indicative of that, because then if a student selects it, you know that. That's kind of how you want to go about creating your distractors. And I talk about that a little bit more in the narration I did about Google Forms that you can look at. Distractors, as I mentioned, they should be inferior or incorrect answers. And we call them distractors because if you haven't mastered the concept yet, then it should distract you. But if you have mastered the concept, it shouldn't distract you at all. So it's irrelevant. All these other answers, 6, 14, that should be meaningless to you if you've mastered the concept. If you've mastered the concept, it doesn't matter what I put here because you know the correct answer. You've already figured it out just by looking at the stem. Then you only go in here to find it. You shouldn't have to look at these to prompt your correct answer. That's kind of what we mean by distractor. It only distracts people that don't know what's going on. If you've mastered the concept and you're distracted, that's a bad sign. They should appear implausible to those people that haven't mastered the thing yet. The other requirement, in addition to distracting people who haven't mastered the content, is that they should be plausible and tell you something about the student. So this next one is kind of a good example here. We looked at this briefly before. So we've got a math case here where we want to see if students have, calculate perimeter. And we've given the information here. We got the prompt. The prompt is all of this thing. And so the thing for you to think about is what would be good distractors for this? Well, once you have your item, you've got your stem here. I like to start with coming up with the correct answer first. That's always a good goal. The reason I come up with it first is because that way I don't forget. Sometimes you have to come up with other options and you forget to make a right one. I may have done that. So, coming up with our different answers here. We've got 120 plus 120, excuse me, plus 110 for the other two sides. 350 would be our correct answer. So we'll just say that's number or letter A right now. Then we need 3 other distractors that are different levels of wrongness. Or to think of that another way, 3 different distractors that if chosen would tell you something about the student. So I'm not a big math person, but when I look at this, the first thing I think of is, okay, well, what happens if they only add the 2 numbers on the page? So they don't know what perimeter is, that they can't calculate that, so they don't know that they have to add up all the sides. They just see the numbers on the page and they add those up. So maybe 175 seems like it would be a good distractor because if a student chooses that, you know that student really doesn't know what perimeter is, can't apply it. Great. That's kind of our 50% wrong answer. I'd also probably put something like 120 maybe as kind of like the 25% correct answer. That's for someone who really doesn't know what they're doing. They just pick a number on the page. So that's like the worst kind of answer. It's not ridiculous, note. It's not Scott Peters. It's kind of still plausible, but it's clearly wrong. That gives us kind of our 25% and 50% wrong items, as well as our 100% correct. Then what's left? Well, I kind of like the idea for this one of doing area. So not 120 plus 120 plus 55 plus 55, instead 120 times 55 to give us 6,600. So my kind of ideal world, working down that model of correct answer, 75% correct, 50%, 25%, we would have 350, which is the correct answer, then 6,600, which is incorrect because it's the area, then maybe 175 because they're adding those two, then just 120. In my mind, those are kind of good distractors to get at 4 different common mistakes. But again, this is really where you as the expert. I'm going to pull off real quick here to make sure I'm still recording. Yes, how wonderful I am. That wasn't all for waste. Great, grand. Continuing on. Got an English example here. You've probably seen things like this. Got a chunk of text. This could be 10 pages. It could be a paragraph. So Max burrowed deep into his sleeping bag, thankful for its warmth as he drifted to sleep. Later, the rain pounded in his sheets. Before long, the icy wet fingers seemed to seep into his sleeping bag, waking him suddenly. So we want to know if students can read this and apply critical reading, can infer things from the text. That's a pretty high-level skill. That's an application or analysis level skill. And the distractors we have here, again, we have the correct answer, which is the words shift the tone from content to uneasy, because it talks about being warm and drifting off to sleep, and then the icy cold, waking him up suddenly to uneasy. We've got curious to bored, humorous to serious, cheerful to angry. To me, these aren't really that different in terms of degree. This is more of like an incorrect or correct kind of answer, where anyone that puts B, C, or D is equally incorrect. There's not really anything better or worse about any of these. And from here, you can only draw the inference of, did the student master it or did they not? Which is okay. That's still useful. It's just not quite as useful as if you can break it down into levels of correctness. You can draw more information out of those types of items. The thing to be coming back to, I'm just bringing this up as kind of a pause. You need to think about what particular skills are needed to get the item right. So for example, in order to get a question right, do they just have to remember some stuff? Or do they have to be able to apply a particular skill in order to get it right? Because the first one would be a remembering item, the second one would be an application level item. To give you some examples of those, well, this would be a remembering level item. If I were to give this to you on a quiz, which of the following items has the same approximate meaning as the word reliability? It's not asking you to apply any skill or to do some kind of analysis or critical reading or anything like that. You just need to remember from class that I've talked about how reliability is consistency, or you just need to remember that from the textbook. So the minimum stuff in your brain necessary to get it right is a remembering level skill. You could maybe get it right by applying something, some kind of critical reasoning, but at bare minimum, all you actually need to have in your brain is that memorized information to get it right. Technically, this is the exact same thing, except this is doing something you should never do, which is it's putting a blank both in the middle of the sentence, so it's now a grammatically incomplete statement, but it's also the first word, which is even worse, because now if I'm an English language learner, it just adds an extra level of reading skill to what I'm trying to measure, which is just unnecessary. It's adding error for no reason. So on this next one, I've got another example here. We're assessing basic memorization again, remembering level content. Who was the president during the Civil War? We've got George W. Bush, Barbara Bush, Abraham Lincoln, and Andrew Johnson. So I'm going to suggest to you that these are some pretty terrible distractors. Remember the rule. We want 4 options. You can have as many as you want, but if there's 4, we want one that is correct, so 100% correct, one that's like 75% correct, one that's like 50, and one that's like 25% correct. Because they're all plausible. That's why we don't have one that's 0% correct, because that wouldn't be plausible. In this case, let's pretend that Abraham Lincoln is our correct answer, 100% correct. What's then our 75%? Well, Andrew Johnson that's kind of like 98%, because technically he was kind of still president during the war. I mean, when does the war, quote, officially over? You could make a pretty good argument that these two are not very far apart. Because of that, Andrew Johnson doesn't make a very good distractor. I don't like that one. Let's go down even farther. Where's our 50%? Well, we have the George Bush here, who was a president, but fairly recently, and your students are probably going to know that Bush was a president fairly recently. So that's probably like 20% correct distractor. And Barbara Bush, again, they might recognize the name, but they might also know that a woman's never been president and can rule that one out. That's probably like a 5% correct answer. This is just a bad distribution of items. So what I want you to think about for a second is, what would make a better distractor if we were going to fix this item? If we were going to replace the Andrew Johnson distractor with something that's a little bit more wrong than Abraham Lincoln but still plausible, what would that be? Or if we were going to replace Barbara Bush with, again, another plausible but incorrect answer, what would it be? This is kind of like thinking about it like your CAA, where you're taking an existing assessment and trying to improve it a little bit. So let's move on from there. Another example. Let's pretend that you want to know, you're me, and you want to know if students remember that reliability can only be from 0 to 1 and that it cannot be negative. So basic memorization, again, pretty low level skill, that's all you want to know. So I've created a STEM for you. Here's your STEM. It says, which of the following reliability coefficients represents the strongest evidence of test-retest reliability? So something I want you to think about is, which of the following would be which of the following distractors would be bad? Wouldn't be following the rules that we've talked about so far. Okay, so let's move on to some more examples. This should look kind of familiar to you. So imagine you had quiz 1 and you've got a question that asks, which of the following is an example of a latent construct? Got compatibility, algebra, classroom, grade, height, blah, blah, blah. This is a good example of when an item is no longer measuring like understanding or application, but instead slips down to memorization. Because we talked about compatibility as an example latent construct in class forever and ever. We've talked about it a ton. So you don't need to now understand what a latent construct is. You just have to remember that compatibility is one. This is why it's important to think about items in terms of what has to be in a student's brain in order to get them correct. In this case, they don't have to understand, therefore it's not an understanding item. All they have to do is remember, so it's only measuring remembering level content. That's a little bit different than something like this. As an example question, where you could say to students, using all multiple choice items will always lead to greater reliability than using essays because, which are the following? First of all, I don't like that because it's not a complete sentence, but let's ignore that. This, they have to apply some kind of skill. They have to apply what they know about multiple choice, about reliability, about essay, to this particular scenario. So this is either an understanding or an application level item. And absent guessing, because of course there's always guessing, absent guessing, there's no way to get this item right unless you're able to understand that content. That's how we know these items are different, and that's kind of the main distinction here.